In January 1484, the English Parliament passed the Titulus Regius law, which formally legitimized the ascension of Richard III to the throne. The law declared that the king had rightfully inherited the crown, while at the same time depriving the children of Edward IV of their right to inheritance on the grounds of alleged illegitimacy. It also reminded its readers that the children of George, Duke of Clarence, had already been excluded from the succession by an earlier statute. The problem, however, was that Richard had already been on the throne for more than 6 months, during which time his rule, in fact, had no legal foundation. It is therefore worth examining more closely what actually occurred from a formal and legal standpoint. Welcome back to Lemmy History. The voice is new. I'll say a little bit more about it in the video on the gunpowder plot, which explains why I was forced to change voices. This video is largely based on the research of Gordon McKelvey, whose work was significantly supported by the Richard III Society. The citation can be found in the description. It is important to note that McKelvey demonstrated that the claim of illegitimacy did not automatically nullify the royal rule of Edward V. Evidence for this can be found in official documents from Richard's reign. In some instances, phrasing such as that found on the 15th of July, 1483, Edward Bastard, last called King Edward V, might suggest that Edward's kingship had been annulled. However, a source dated the 16th of December, 1483, originating directly from Richard's government, indicates otherwise. It refers to Edward V the Bastard, last king, implying that Richard acknowledged Edward's kingship despite his alleged illegitimacy. Titulus Regius only altered the situation to the extent that the designation bastard was omitted. For instance, in an examination of John Weston's estate, dated the 25th of September, 1484, his date of death was simply recorded as the 1st of June, the first year of Edward V's reign. This shows that the traditional assumption that Richard entirely invalidated Edward's reign is mistaken, since by such reasoning Richard could never have inherited the crown. In doing so, however, he exposed himself to considerable political danger. To understand this, we must briefly consider 3 theoretical principles of the English monarchy. First, there cannot be 2 kings at the same time. The monarch is the supreme sovereign, anointed by God, a position that cannot be divided or shared. Yet during the Wars of the Roses, the reality was often quite different. Edward IV and Henry VI were both alive and each laid claim to the throne, even during times when they were not in actual possession of power. To address this problem, contemporaries developed a new conceptual distinction. They separated the king who held authority de facto from the one who possessed it de jure. When Henry VI briefly returned to power in 1470, his supporters argued that he had always been king de jure and was now king de facto once more. Edward IV, for his part, used identical reasoning to justify his own position. According to this idea, the one true king was he who had the strongest legal claim to the crown. This reasoning made it possible to validate the laws enacted by a usurped predecessor without having to explain the contradiction of having overthrown him. Secondly, there was not a single moment in which England was without a king. The instant one monarch died, his lawful heir became the next. This continuity was essential because the king was the head of England's entire administrative machinery. Laws were enacted in his name and with his consent. Every court judgment was pronounced under his authority, and official acts required his seals to take effect. The monarchy, as an institution, had to be embodied in a person, whether that person was capable of ruling or not, Even a child king fulfilled this role simply by existing. Without a monarch, the system could not function. This leads to the third principle. There was no legal mechanism by which a king could be deposed. A monarch could lose his crown in only two lawful ways: by death or by abdication. Edward II and Richard II were both compelled to abdicate. During the Wars of the Roses, however, this principle broke down in practice, giving rise to the distinction between a de jure and a de facto monarch explained above. The underlying logic was that if a de facto king lacked a legitimate legal claim to rule, he was not truly king at all. Under this reasoning, it became possible to appoint a new monarch. Richard III officially came to power according to this principle. A meeting of the estates offered him the crown on the 25th of June, 1483, citing the illegitimacy of his nephews, and he accepted it. According to this logic, Richard was in fact already de jure king from the moment of Edward IV's death. But now he had become so de facto as well. We find this idea, for example, in the instructions by which Richard released his subjects from their oaths of allegiance to Edward V. In these, he explained that the people had not known that Richard himself possessed the true and rightful claim to the crown of England, and that therefore they must henceforth give their loyalty to him. Edward IV had faced a somewhat similar situation in 1461, but he was able to secure his crown both legally and practically by his victory at Towton, which was regarded as divine judgment in his favor. He ruled, therefore, by the law of conquest. Richard, however, had no such battle to rely upon. More importantly, even when he released his subjects from their previous oaths, he was forced, implicitly at least, to acknowledge that they had accepted Edward V as their legitimate king. Legally, Richard's view of the situation was as follows. Edward V had been proclaimed king according to the law and had been accepted by his subjects in that role through their oaths. Yet the law itself rested upon false assumptions. Therefore, Richard argued, his own elevation to kingship was valid, a claim which he said could be demonstrated by the petition of the Assembly of the Estates. But this reasoning created a fundamental problem. Edward V was de jure king. He had neither abdicated nor, so far as was publicly known, died. Richard had nothing in law to set against this fact. The same applied to the coronation, which was legally ineffective without the confirmation of statute. As an example, Lambert Simnel too was crowned king, but this did not alter the legal reality of his position. Moreover, the petition of the Assembly of the Estates was not in itself legally binding, since only Parliament could enact laws. Richard, therefore, could not directly challenge the statute by which the crown had been conferred upon Edward V. The consequences of this uncertainty were immediate. The Buckingham Rebellion broke out in the name of the princes in the Tower. If Edward V was still alive, he represented what was called a floating king, a monarch who possessed a legal claim to the throne but could not enforce it. Richard, on the other hand, was the seated king, a ruler de facto, yet without a legitimate legal title. Only the Titulus Regius brought clarity, making him king both legally and factually, and doing so retroactively. Taken to its logical conclusion, this means that Edward V remained, de jure, King of England until January 1484. If he was alive, Richard's problem was that he could not completely annul Edward's reign retroactively. Doing so would have invalidated all governmental acts carried out in Edward's name, many of which Richard himself, as regent, had authorized. While Richard could release his subjects from their oaths of allegiance to Edward V, he could not erase those oaths from existence. this situation was highly dangerous. If Richard had declared Edward's entire reign void, he would have branded as traitors all who had sworn allegiance to Edward V for supporting a false king. That group included not only his subjects, but also himself, his family, and the entire political elite of England. Theoretically, he might have followed the precedent set by his brother. Edward IV had pardoned everyone who recognized him as the rightful king. However, Edward IV possessed a crucial legal foundation in the Act of Accord, which named him heir to the crown and legitimized his claim. Richard had no such statute to rely upon. Without acknowledging Edward V's reign up until the declaration of illegitimacy, Richard would have forced the nation to choose between them, and the outcome might not have favored him, since he had been the de facto ruler during those weeks. In effect, he would have undermined his own authority and invalidated his own prior acts of governance. Legally, Richard was therefore trapped. Even if the boys had died in the tower, their sisters remained alive, and they still possessed a stronger legal claim to the crown than he did. Titulus Regius therefore does not mention Edward V by name, but refers instead to the children of Edward IV. Moreover, it does not explicitly state that they were barred from inheriting the crown. Rather, it declares that they had no right of inheritance at all. This distinction is crucial, for it reveals the dilemma Richard faced. He had to acknowledge Edward V's reign up to the moment of his own usurpation, yet he also needed to justify his seizure of the throne. Accordingly, the statute could not address the children's right of inheritance and the crown within the same provision. It is not as though Richard was unaware of this himself. We find the following passage in Titulus Regius, which forms the true legal justification for his otherwise titleless accession. The prosperity of this land daily declined, so that happiness was turned into misery, and prosperity into adversity. The order of governance and of the law of God and man was thrown into confusion. Therefore, it is likely that this realm will fall into utter misery and desolation, which God forbid, unless suitable remedy be duly provided for this matter with all possible haste. England, then, was portrayed as being in a state of emergency that demanded immediate remedy. Richard, in response to this crisis, had reached for the crown. Titulus Regius merely established that he was the lawful person to provide such a remedy. In the end, however, this meant that Richard III became King of England by right of conquest. Not a single document exists stating that Edward V was ever formally deposed. Instead, a rival monarch emerged who secured power against the will of the legally recognized king, and only more than half a year later obtained legal confirmation of that power. The justification given was a national emergency, exacerbated by the prior king's supposedly false lineage. This leads to two conclusions. First, Richard's recognition of Edward's reign makes his own accession an act of usurpation. Second, his authority ultimately rested on the right of conquest. Nothing, however, should be inferred from this regarding the ever-present question of the prince's fate. Richard's nieces also posed a legal problem, yet they remained alive. The importance of this legal dimension is evident in the fact that Richard's reign stabilized only after the enactment of Titulus Regius. The suppression of the Buckingham Rebellion was undoubtedly the central prerequisite for achieving this final act of legal consolidation. In the end, Richard's crown rested less on law than on circumstance, a truth that would soon return to haunt him. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.